The impact was instant. I don't remember pain. I remember light. I remember peace. And then I remember waking up above my body, watching the chaos unfold below me. 1 second I was gripping the steering wheel, exhausted from a long day at work, and the next, I was weightless. Everything happened so fast, like a blink, yet it felt like time stretched. The crash was deafening. The sound of metal crumpling, the shatter of glass. It was chaos, but I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anything at first. Then, I was floating. I looked down and saw myself. My body slumped behind the wheel, the windshield shattered, blood on my forehead. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even confused. I was just there, watching. I remember the panic outside the car. I heard voices shouting, tires screeching, someone yelling for an ambulance. I saw the driver of the other car, dazed and bleeding, being pulled from his vehicle. I saw my car crumpled against a streetlight, and I saw my body, still lifeless. I wanted to speak, to tell them I was okay, but I couldn't. I was separate from it all, watching like a ghost. Then, something pulled me upward. Not violently, not forcefully, just a gentle, irresistible movement, like I was being drawn toward a place I was meant to be. I passed above the scene, the flashing lights of the ambulance, the people running toward me, and suddenly everything faded. The noise, the pain, the fear, it was gone. And then I was in the tunnel of light. The tunnel was unlike anything I've ever seen. It wasn't dark or scary like I'd heard some people describe. It was warm, like the most comforting embrace I'd ever felt. The light wasn't blinding, it was soft, pure, and inviting. I moved through it effortlessly, like I was being carried by something greater than myself. There was no fear, no panic, just a deep, unshakable peace. As I traveled through the tunnel, I felt lighter, like a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. Memories flickered through my mind, not in order but in flashes of moments that had shaped me. Some were joyful, some were painful, but none of them held me down. I felt cleansed, as if every wrong thing I had ever done was being wiped away. Then, the tunnel opened up, and I stepped into something beyond words. I was no longer in darkness or transition. I was in heaven. The beauty of it was overwhelming. The sky, if you could even call it that, was radiant, filled with colors I don't have names for. There was a sense of perfect harmony, like every part of creation was in tune with something greater. I could feel the presence of God like a warmth in my soul, a deep knowing that I was home. I wasn't alone. There were others around me, souls, spirits, beings of light. Some I recognized, others I didn't, but they all radiated joy, peace, and love beyond anything I had ever known. I felt like I belonged, like I had finally arrived where I was always meant to be. As I stood in that radiant light, I began to notice something extraordinary. There were levels, distinct layers of heaven stretching upward into an endless brilliance. Each level was more magnificent than the one before, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pulse with divine energy. The highest levels were so pure, so filled with light, that they almost felt like they were part of God Himself. The closer I looked, the more I could see that each level was inhabited by different souls, each one reflecting the life they had lived on earth. I saw people I recognized, believers I had known in life, saints who had lived with unwavering faith, and angels who moved with grace and purpose. Some stood in the highest levels, surrounded by a light so brilliant it was almost impossible to look at. Their joy was overwhelming, their peace unshakable. They radiated holiness, and I could feel the weight of their righteousness, the depth of their surrender to God. These were the ones who had lived not just for themselves, but for Him. Those who had loved without hesitation, served without expectation, and walked in obedience no matter the cost. But then I saw others, still in heaven, but not as high. They were still in the light, still joyful, but their glow was dimmer, their presence less radiant. These were believers, good people, faithful in their own way, but they had been lukewarm. They had followed God, but not fully. They had known truth, but hadn't lived it completely. I could see it in the way they stood, in the way they looked around, almost as if they were aware of the distance between themselves and the highest realms. It wasn't a punishment. It was just the way things were. Heaven wasn't just one place for everyone. It was layered, divided by the depth of one's faith, the purity of their heart, and the way they had chosen to live. And as I looked at those in the lower levels, I felt a deep sorrow, not because they were lost, but because they had missed something greater. They were saved, but they had not fully embraced the fullness of what God had prepared for those who truly loved Him. As I moved through the levels of heaven, I saw the saints, those who had lived lives of deep devotion, sacrifice, and love. Some I recognized from history, others from my own life. There was a woman who had spent decades in prayer, fasting, and service. She stood in the highest level, surrounded by a light so pure it made my soul ache. There was a man who had given up everything to preach the gospel in distant lands, who had suffered persecution but never wavered. He stood beside angels, radiant and unshaken, his joy uncontainable. The angels were unlike anything I had imagined. They weren't just beautiful, they were powerful, filled with purpose. Some had wings that shimmered like the sky at dawn. Others had faces that held the wisdom of eternity. They moved with grace, not in chaos, but in perfect harmony, each one serving a role in the divine order. Some sang, their voices weaving together in a melody that wasn't just sound, but pure worship. Others carried messages, delivering them to souls with reverence and love. And the joy, oh, the joy was indescribable. There was no sadness, no regret, no longing. Every soul there was at peace, fulfilled in a way I had never known. They weren't just happy, they were complete. They had found what we all long for here on earth. Perfect love, perfect purpose, perfect presence. And as I watched them, I realized that this was what we were made for. This was our destiny. But not everyone would reach the same heights. The difference wasn't in salvation, it was in surrender. As I continued to observe the different levels of heaven, I saw believers who were still in the light, but not as close to the highest realms. They were still joyful, still peaceful, but their radiance was dimmer, their presence less intense. I could feel a difference, not of condemnation, but of distance. They were saved, but they had not fully embraced the depth of God's love or lived in complete surrender. Some of them had been good people, kind, generous, even faithful in their own way. But their hearts had been divided. They had loved God, but not with all their heart, soul, and mind. They had served Him, but only when it was convenient. They had believed, but had not fully trusted. I could see it in the way they stood, in the way they looked at the higher levels with something like longing. They weren't in pain, but they weren't experiencing the fullness of what was available. I saw a man who had once been a pastor, respected and loved in his church. He had grown complacent. He had stopped seeking God with the same passion, had allowed distractions to take root. He was in heaven, yes, but he was not in the highest place. He was still joyful, still worshiping, but I could see in his eyes that he knew he had missed something. And then there was a woman who had lived a decent life, never harming anyone, always doing what she thought was right. She had gone to church, helped others when she could, but she had never fully surrendered her heart. She had never truly let go of her pride, her self-reliance. She was in heaven, surrounded by light, but she was not basking in its fullness. It wasn't punishment, it was consequence. The rewards of heaven weren't just about being there. They were about how deeply one had lived for God. And as I watched those in the lower levels, I felt a deep sorrow. Not because they were lost, but because they had settled for less than what God had prepared for those who truly loved Him. Then, just as suddenly as I had risen into heaven, I felt myself being pulled downward. It wasn't violent. It was more like a shift in gravity, a sudden awareness that I was no longer in the presence of light. The warmth, the joy, the overwhelming peace, it all vanished. I was moving fast, but this time, the tunnel was dark. Not just dark, but heavy, oppressive. The deeper I went, the colder it became. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful silence of heaven, but an eerie, suffocating emptiness. There was no music, no voices, no comfort. Just an absence of everything good. Then, as I descended further, the silence broke. I heard weeping, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that echoed through the darkness. I saw shadows moving, but they weren't people. They were souls trapped in torment. Hell wasn't just one place. It had levels just like heaven. The deeper I went, the worse it became. The first levels were filled with anguish, souls crying out, writhing in pain, their expressions twisted with regret. They were aware of what they had lost, of the heaven they had rejected. Some reached out, their eyes pleading, but there was no mercy, no way out. Further down, the torment intensified. I saw people I recognized, some who had lived wicked lives, others who had once professed faith in Christ, but had walked away. They were in deeper levels, surrounded by fire that didn't burn but consumed the soul. The torment wasn't physical alone. It was spiritual. It was the weight of knowing they had turned from the only one who could save them. And then I saw the lowest levels, the deepest, darkest pits of hell. The silence there was absolute. No weeping, no movement. Just an unbearable stillness, a void where hope had been erased. Those in the lowest depths had not only rejected God, they had led others astray, had twisted truth into lies, had chosen evil with full knowledge of the light. I felt my soul recoil. I wanted to turn away, to run back to the light, but I couldn't. I had to see. I had to understand. And as I watched, I realized that hell wasn't just a place of punishment. It was the final consequence of a heart that had refused to surrender. The further I descended into hell, the more unbearable it became. The air was thick, suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my very soul. I could feel the torment before I even saw it, a deep, aching sorrow that wasn't just in the souls trapped there. It was in the very atmosphere. The cries of anguish grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the darkness like a never-ending storm. I saw people I had known in life, some who had lived wicked lives, others who had once walked with God but had turned away. I recognized one man who had once been a preacher, someone who had stood behind a pulpit and spoken of salvation. But his heart had been divided. He had preached the truth, but lived in hypocrisy. He had drawn crowds, but sought their praise more than God's. Now he was in a place of torment, his face twisted in anguish, his hands clawing at the darkness as if trying to escape something unseen. She had stopped seeking God, allowed bitterness to take root, and turned away from the truth she once knew. Now she was in a place where the fire didn't burn, but the pain was real. Her eyes were hollow, her spirit broken. She knew what she had lost. She had once walked in the light, but had chosen to walk away. The deeper I went, the worse it became. There were souls trapped in darkness, so complete that they couldn't even see one another. Some were silent, their torment too deep for words. Others screamed, their voices raw with regret. I saw people who had lived lives of deception, who had twisted truth into lies, who had led others astray. They were in the lowest depths, surrounded by a torment that wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. It was the weight of knowing they had turned from the only one who could save them. And then I saw the most terrifying sight of all. Those who had once served God, who had known his love, but had turned their backs on him. They were in the deepest levels, surrounded by a darkness so thick it felt like it was consuming them. Their eyes were empty, their spirits shattered. They had once walked in the light, but had chosen to walk away. And now there was no way back. The most haunting thing about hell wasn't the fire or the darkness. It was the regret. Every soul trapped there knew exactly what they had lost. They weren't confused, they weren't ignorant. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them, forever. There was no denial, no excuse, no way to undo what had been done. The torment wasn't just in the suffering. It was in the knowledge that they had once had the chance to escape it. I saw a man who had lived a life of selfishness, who had turned away from God, believing he could do things his own way. Now he was surrounded by torment, his face twisted in agony. But more than the pain, I could see the horror in his eyes. The realization that he had rejected the only one who could have saved him. He had known the truth, maybe not in detail, but enough to understand that there was something greater than himself. And he had chosen to ignore it. I saw a woman who had once been a believer, who had walked with God for a time, but had drifted away. She had told herself she would return one day, that she still believed that she was saved. But she had postponed her surrender, let distractions take root, and now she was in a place where there was no second chance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She knew she had been given grace, had been offered mercy, but she had squandered it. The weight of their regret was unbearable. It wasn't just sorrow. It was finality. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, no hope. They had made their choice, and now they had to live with it for eternity. And as I stood there, witnessing the depth of their torment, I understood why heaven had levels. It wasn't just about being saved. It was about how deeply one had lived for God. And hell was the same. It wasn't just about being lost. It was about how deeply one had rejected him. I was still absorbing everything when I became aware of a presence beside me. At first, I didn't see anyone. I just felt it, like a warmth that wasn't the same as the light of heaven, but something deeper, more profound. Then slowly, a figure began to take shape. It wasn't human, not in the way we understand, but it had a form. Tall, radiant, filled with an authority that was both comforting and overwhelming. The being didn't speak in words, not exactly. Instead, understanding flowed into my mind, as if I had always known what it was telling me. It wasn't just information. It was truth, pure and unfiltered. And in that moment, I understood everything. It showed me the purpose of the levels in heaven, not as a hierarchy of worth, but as a reflection of the heart's devotion. Those who had lived with full surrender, who had loved God with every part of themselves, stood in the highest realms, closest to his presence. Those who had followed him but held back, those who had been lukewarm, who had known the truth but hadn't fully embraced it, were still in the light but not as close. It wasn't punishment. It was the natural result of their choices. Then, it turned my attention to hell. The being didn't explain it in words, but I felt it. The depth of the rejection, the finality of the choice. Those in the deepest levels had not only turned from God, but had hardened their hearts against him, had led others astray, had chosen darkness with full knowledge of the light. And now there was no way back. The being didn't condemn, didn't judge. It simply revealed. And in that revelation, I understood the urgency of surrender. Not just belief, not just going through the motions, but full, unwavering devotion. Because heaven wasn't just a place you entered. It was a place you grew into. And hell wasn't just a place you went to. It was a place you chose. The being didn't speak in words, but the message was clear. My time here was not over. I had been shown these things not just for my own understanding, but so I could carry the truth back with me. I felt a deep urgency settle in my soul, knowing that I had to share what I had seen. I was shown the weight of our choices, how every decision we make, every step we take, shapes our eternity. It wasn't just about being saved. It was about how we live after we're saved. Those who had lived with full surrender, who had loved God with all their heart, soul, and mind, stood in the highest realms of heaven. Those who had been lukewarm, who had known the truth but had not fully embraced it, were still in the light, but not as close. And those who had rejected God, who had hardened their hearts, who had led others astray, those were in the depths of hell, knowing exactly what they had lost. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. I had to live differently. I had to stop treating my faith as something I could check off on Sundays. I had to pursue God with everything I had, not just when it was convenient. I had to love him more than anything else. And I had to share this truth with others, because they needed to know that heaven and hell were real, and that our choices mattered. The being didn't tell me to preach or write a book. It simply showed me that I had to live with purpose, with passion, with full surrender. And as I felt myself being drawn back, pulled toward my body, I knew I could never be the same again. The pull back was sudden, like a tether snapping me toward something I couldn't resist. The warmth of heaven, the clarity of the message, it all began to fade, replaced by a sharp, jarring sensation. I felt my body before I saw it, like I was being forced back into something heavy, something broken. Then pain. A dull ache that spread through every part of me, a reminder that I was still in this world. I opened my eyes to blinding lights and the sharp beeping of machines. The smell of antiseptic stung my nose, and the sterile cold of the hospital room wrapped around me like a shock to my soul.